Okay, let's get going. So good morning to those of you in the Americas. Good afternoon if you're in Europe, or good evening if you're further east. My name is Steve Lewis, and I'm a Senior Director of Risk Tech based in the UK. Thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to this Risk Tech webinar. The topic today is about safety culture, in particular its role in achieving the goal of continual improvement in safety performance. And hopefully we can provide some useful and practical insights for you. Before we get going, we've got a little bit of housekeeping to do. We've muted everybody, so the sound won't be distorted by any background noise. And if you'd like to ask questions, and we really would, encourage you to ask questions, please, then please use the instant messaging function. So that's that little white speech bubble down in the left-hand corner of your screen. If you click on that, you can just type your message in. And what we'll do is I'll keep track of those questions as we go along. And we'll aim to cover as many of them as we can at the end of the session, and certainly within the 40 minutes or so that we have available today. Okay, what I'd like to do now is just briefly introduce Risk Tech to those of you who don't know us. Apologies if you've already heard this about half a dozen times before. I will be pretty quick. We have over 300 people across 16 offices worldwide. We're part of the TÜV Rheinland Group, which is a €2 billion provider of testing, inspection and certification services. We provide 5 different business lines, consulting being our major activity, where we provide a range of specialist risk and safety management solutions. We also provide online and classroom training and postgraduate education up to MSc level in risk and safety management. We also provide associates who can work at client locations where the client might have an issue of where they have a sort of limited resource or sort of skill shortage. We also provide industrial inspection and integrity management services to help ensure asset integrity. And we also undertake research and development activities in the field of risk and safety management. I'd now like to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Liz Ho. Liz is a principal human factors consultant based in our London office in the UK. She's a chartered occupational health and safety specialist. She's got at least 20 years of experience. Apparently she only updates that every 5 years these days, in both an advisory and enforcement capacity. And that's across a range of industrial and service sectors such as rail, aviation, oil and gas, nuclear and the emergency services. Now this experience is pretty broad and really quite varied, and includes the use of safety climate tools and leading behavioural safety workshops, competency needs analysis, undertaking safety management audits and gap analyses, root cause analysis and incident investigation, and then also delivering lessons learned workshops, all aimed at ensuring the continual improvement in an organisation's safety management performance. Okay, Liz, over to you.
Thanks very much, Steve, for the introduction. Welcome to you all. So what am I going to cover today? Well, I'm going to look at explore what is meant by the term safety culture, how we might measure it and assess it against models such as the safety climate maturity ladder, and also the importance of understanding the role of safety culture in human behaviour. So we're going to explore how an organisation's culture may impact on performance, on compliance, on elements such as change management and the overall effectiveness of a safety management system. So basic components of today, how we can measure it, I say that continual improvement, and I'm going to keep referring to this term, we've always done it this way. And I think it's a really useful way of exploring safety culture and achieving the goal of continual improvement. And I think it's quite illustrative of norms of behaviour and attitudes and belief. So before we discuss safety culture specifically, we really need to understand what we mean by organisational culture as a whole. So many of you may be aware of James Reason. He's a leading academic on work on human error, and he's most famous for the Swiss cheese model. He defined culture as a collective outcome from people's actions, their values, competencies and beliefs. So culture can be a reference marker that can be used by employees to determine what's considered to be important within the business that they're working within. So what's being measured or valued by the business, and therefore what individuals need to focus on within their day-to-day role. It's often termed the norm, i.e. that's considered normal in any given workplace. However, what we have to remember is that culture is not a static situation, it can change. Organisational norms can be really powerful. People have a strong desire to be accepted by the group that they want to belong to. This is particularly key when we look at compliance with sets of rules, for instance, or procedures. Humans, by our nature, we're social creatures and we fear rejection from our pack, our group or our community. So in a rule-abiding group, non-conformance with established norms of behaviour could lead to rejection from the group. So actual or perceived pressure to conform with peer group norms can perpetuate bad practices in sort of contrast to that. So to overcome this, we need to establish positive organisational culture. You'll see reference in today's webinar to the expression, "we've always done it this way," and we're going to explore what this means. Firstly, though, we should remember that organisational culture is a learned situation. It can develop and it can change. So the term safety culture was introduced by the International Atomic Energy Agency following the nuclear reactor accident at Chernobyl. After Chernobyl, people understood that the reasons for accidents were not just technical faults or human errors made by one individual, but that they could involve management, organisational failings and attitudes, all of which can influence safety for the better or for the worse. So safety culture refers to those aspects of organisational culture which contribute to an organisation's health and safety management. So the definition on the top left is the most widely used and was developed by the Advisory Committee on the Safety of Nuclear Installations. The safety culture of an organisation is the product of individual and group values, attitudes, perceptions, competencies and patterns. And I want you to consider the key word in that, product. They determine the commitment to, again quite key, and the style and proficiency of an organisation's health and safety management. Perhaps a more user-friendly definition found in the Cullen report into the Ladbroke Grove rail crash in 2000 was the way we do things around here. So the model on the right of the slide allows us to explore factors which will influence an organisation's underlying safety culture. All or some of the factors may affect the way we do things around here. This will be a dynamic effect. Some will be direct, others have more of an interaction with others, and their effects may depend on circumstances. They may be constant or they may fluctuate. An organisation's culture will alter what everyone within the organisation prioritises and focuses on. Think of it like a theatre spotlight. So the theatre, the stage is dark, you turn the light on. So though that focus alters what aspects are valued by staff and what knowledge is important to focus on and use, it directs everyone's expectations. Everyone will be aware of what's expected of them by the organisation due to their perception of the culture that is around them. So then in turn, people will undertake their everyday work activities, including safe working methods. Again, remember the culture of an organisation is determined by more than a set of rules and procedures. It's abstract and dynamic, and it's made up of many components. It's the culture that largely determines whether an individual follows a rule or procedure, not just whether the rule or procedure is in place or if the individual has been trained or is being supervised to ensure that they're following it. So, most importantly, it's not a static entity. Following things like organisational changes, they might be in management, they might be in the organisational structure, they might be from learning from a large-scale incident, for instance, or even near misses. Culture can become less or more mature. An organisation's culture can be greatly influenced by the local, the national, the international, and the socio-economic climate that surrounds it and that it exists within, and therefore it might change over time in relation to this. Much research has been conducted to define and model culture and determine the impact that these various stages of cultural development have and how cultural improvements can be developed and implemented. So the aim is to actively improve safety risk management and workplace efficiency and productivity. So to achieve this, it's often helpful to provide a measure of culture to indicate how mature it's at or whether it's become less mature over time. So what does good look like? Many of you may be familiar with this model. Organisations will sit on the continuum in terms of safety maturity, so somewhere on this upward scale of safety maturity. There are various models of safety culture maturity. This particular slide shows the Parker and Hudson model. That's the staged approach. Within the model, progress occurs over time, eventually hopefully reaching a development stage that makes the organisation more impervious to incidents and accidents. So as you move up the cultural ladder, you'll see that there becomes greater acceptance that there are more advanced safety cultures than your own organisation, as well as an understanding of what that means for your own organisation and what stage you've reached. So as a company moves up the ladder, it becomes increasingly informed, open and able to learn. So that cycle of continuous improvement will be seen to a lot higher level at the generative than it would, for instance, at pathological, where the organisation considers that safety is a hurdle to them doing business. So there are 5 maturity stages in this particular model, from pathological, don't get caught doing something wrong, through calculative, which most companies in the Western world manage to reach, to generative or high reliability organisations. The thing with this model is beware of getting stuck at the calculative stage. So many organisations will get to the point where they have rules and regulations, a strong safety management procedure, but they're still using lagging measures. They're governed by their rules. They don't necessarily have a proactive or a open to learning culture that you will see in the proactive and generative stages. So what are some of the characteristics of the calculative level? So safety is managed on the basis of procedures and documents using lagging indicators, as I've said. What you'll see is a lack of open and honest communication. So, for instance, rules may not be challenged, decisions may not be challenged, people may not feel at, say, for instance, the workforce level, that ability to have open dialogue about whether those procedures are actually appropriate or are working. When incidents occur, root cause analysis is not being fully conducted. Error is often attributed purely at the individual level. So often accident reports at this stage will have a finding of human error. Culture might be blamed for incidents without any greater understanding of what that means. And very often departments will operate in isolation and lessons are not learnt across the company, whether that be regional or international, and improvements are consequently not made. So what we see is that sort of upward improvement, striving for continuous improvement at the top level, increasingly informed, so management will know what's going on around them. They know what goes on around here, they understand the culture. There's an increasing level of trust to tell the truth and do what actually has to be done. At the pathological, at the lowest level, you might hear the expression, of course we have accidents, it's a dangerous business. At this point, it's bad news that can be ignored. At the reactive level, you have to understand it's different around here, you might hear spoken. If only workers would do what they're supposed to. We need to force compliance. Again, bad news is kept hidden and thus can't be learned from. At the calculative level, we've cracked it. The system should have worked. And this is where we'll often see management and organisational failings being the weakness that we're going to come on and see in the Swiss cheese model, the barrier that's most likely to fail. Proactive, you'll see accidents are fully investigated and learnt from, actions are being put in place and recommendations to keep control measures in place and prevent them failing. And then generative is that willingness to try and exceed existing high standards. So why am I talking about human behaviour? Well, the effectiveness of safety management systems and our own risk management processes, even in high hazard industries, relies really heavily on human performance. So as we've seen, safety culture has a significant impact on how people behave, what they value and what they don't. So this interactive relationship creates, as we'll see from the next slide, expectations and norms of behaviour which form the foundations of safety culture. Therefore, the human element of a safety management system can be regarded as the strongest and the weakest link in the effective safe performance of an organisation. So this model shown is adapted from the theory of planned behaviour, which is a well-respected model used in behavioural science. It demonstrates, in my opinion, in a really clear form, the interaction of the factors influencing how and why norms and expectations of behaviour develop and arise. On the people side, on the right-hand side, we'll also see the new element of control of the environment. And this will include things like personal motivation, personal choice, can be described as behavioural economics, so weighing up what is the best option for the individual. What does the individual need from the situation? And this can be shown further in the next slide on the COM-B model. But you can see here that really interactive balance between what the organisation as a whole and external factors bring, if you like, to internal culture and safety culture versus what individual people are bringing and also their needs and motivations. So there's quite a complex interaction of factors here to make safety culture. So I think this is a really simple but effective model. It's one of my favourites for looking at this behavioural economics. It looks at can I, why would I, and what do I get from the behaviour that I want to carry out. I think it's visually appealing and it's quite useful to apply to, say, for instance, if I give you an example of wearing PPE in an organisation, so or any other safe system of work, it can show the barriers to why it isn't being done or why rule violations are occurring. For instance, is the organisation listening to the workforce and taking on feedback? So PPE might be being provided, the opportunity might be there, but it might be ill-fitting, or it might make the task slower, or it might even make the task impossible. So that's, looks at opportunity. Motivation, so have the workforce bought into the risk that is being managed here? Do they understand? Do they have risk awareness as to what it's managing? Is there peer pressure to like behave in a certain way that motivates and directs their behaviour, and have they got the capability to engage in that activity? Is it working for them? So we've looked at organisational level, we've looked at the blend of the workforce with the more external sort of holistic organisational factors. I think we also need to, whilst culture is a product of group behaviours, we also need to consider the potential for very specific individual differences. So each individual is a collection of sort of general characteristics and specific individualistic characteristics, and they both influence the way we behave. So we receive information through all our sensory organs from the world around us, and from that, whether it be temperature, sound, a visual image, we build up what psychologists call a mental model, how we understand the world. And that, whilst it allows us to be, the skilled human beings with very quick thought, reactive processes, fast motor responses to things, also can cause us to have a biased view of the world. So we might miss warning signs if the world isn't as we think it is. So why is it important to understand this? Well, it might help sometimes explain why certain behaviours are going on. It might help us understand why safe working practices aren't being followed, for instance. We may want to change values and attitudes, which are some of the most important drivers for an individual's behavioural choices. And these can help to ensure that people's behaviours are appropriate. It's not easy to try and alter an individual's underlying values and attitudes. They're quite deep-seated within all of us. but it's often considered easier to try and change an individual or group's outward behaviours in the workplace. And as this is a two-way relationship, if we change someone's behaviours at work, it can eventually lead to a change in attitudes and values long term. So as we have seen, human behaviours and their underlying drivers develop over time, and they're a product of their individual biological makeup, their cultural influences, and their life experiences and associated memories and learning. But they can also affected by many other individual factors, and they're covered here. So, our personalities, how sensitive we are to risk, what do we believe, what's our moral opinions and our motivations in life, what is our emotional response to something. It might be our training, our experience, all under the umbrella of competency. So the risk target, is the target of the risk actually themselves, or is it perhaps the family? When you come home from work, are you taking the risk back? So for someone who's perhaps worked with asbestos, etc., the risk could be wider than just the actual person exposed at the workplace. So the level of control that the individual feels they may have over their own exposure to risk. So that's quite a key one for humans. We do like to sort of be in charge of our own destiny, and that can often lead to sort of rules being challenged. So we've only really got to think about the current situation with COVID-19, for instance, to realise the enormous differences in risk perception. So the analogy I use for this is we are all in the same storm, but we're all in very different boats. So this expression recognises that every day we all experience the world very differently from each other, depending on our own personal circumstances. So whether that be many of us working from home, where the impact of work and our home life may be becoming increasingly blurred, we all turn up to work every day with our own personal perceptions of risk and the world around us. So this is the Swiss cheese model, or a sort of visual adaptation of it by James Reason. What it does show is three ways in which safety culture can undermine the layers of protection that are offered by a safety management system. So, for instance, the failure to identify error traps. So there's an inherent weakness in the barriers preventing major accident hazards. So the organisation might start to see an increase in non-compliances with procedures and safe systems of work. Secondly, poor risk awareness may result in a failure for people to understand the consequences of operational hazards. So this in turn might increase the number of holes in the barriers that you might be seeing. They might arise as latent or later conditions or organisational failings. So, for instance, a good example of this is a lack of emergency planning or failing to provide adequate equipment at the planning stage. And also working around known weaknesses in your management system rather than actually dealing with them. This will further erode the layers of protection. So I think it's worth considering a sort of grey area, if you like, between deliberate violations, behaviour that is reckless or done with malice, a deliberate violation of a rule, to what is known as routine or optimising or even situational violations. So optimising is, what's in it for me, making the best of something. It might be something as simple as shortcutting off a path, across a grassed area. That's an optimising violation. And then on the right-hand side of the scale, we have human errors, so mistakes, lapses in attention, perhaps a physical slip, you press the wrong button in error. These are an unintentional act that has a different consequence to what was intended. So why do violations occur? I think this is a really useful model, and it links safety culture within the organisation. So on the right-hand side, you've got things that are modifying people's behaviour. So we've spoken about group and peer pressure. At the job level, there might be pressure from supervisors to to deliver and perform on time. And then back down to the individual level, we're looking at that element that I've just covered on risk perception. And then the direct motivators are the organisational elements. So they might be, pressure to get the job done by whatever means. Seen particularly at Chernobyl, I think a very good example of, external cultural elements, socioeconomic pressures at the time to do the best job, to be seen to be leading in the nuclear industry was far greater than actually following the procedure. It might be that the individual has not been trained, so there might be a direct reason why the rules have been violated. So why might people break the rules? Well, I think just a quick summary, it might be, again, down to our individual differences. It's that behavioural economics, balancing what do I gain versus what do I lose. In the workplace, people might take shortcuts when they believe that the risk is quite low, or they've become, and I don't like the use of the word complacent, but I think familiar is a better word, where you've been doing the job every day and you've perhaps underestimated the risk because you are aware, in the same way that once as human beings we've learnt to walk, we don't generally fear falling. We know that we have the capability to walk in a straight line. And in the same way, in a workplace, familiarity with the task will give us that comfort, that sense that we can carry it out successfully. We might look at the sort of reward versus gain, again with regards to what is making you want to do a good job. Also the consequences perhaps of failing to do the good job. Perhaps if the culture is one of a fear of losing the job or jobs insecurity, that might lead to more rule violations. With regards to what is measured is what is done. Again, that highlights to staff what is important and what they should be focusing on. So if a management system is measuring the wrong things, then that will put the spotlight on the wrong priorities. So if you really want to improve safe operations, there needs to be a mixture of leading and lagging safety related measures to ensure that balance in values and priorities. And that will come from the supervisors and the management behaviours, and we'll see in a moment the importance of leadership. So if we want to improve safety culture, it's useful to first measure where the organisation is on that continuum of safety maturity that I've mentioned, and also understand where the weaknesses are. And the best way to do that is a safety culture survey. So this is a proactive tool. It looks at the level using a validated questionnaire. It will look at the initial safety culture level and possible problem areas. So it allows you to highlight the difference perhaps between regions or departments or roles, or even different levels of roles. So whether or not that be the management team versus perhaps the shop floor workforce or people working in a particular area, and can often have some a really interesting highlight on the results that it shows. It will include the highest direct safety risk areas, and also the areas where staff want to see change and improvement in their workplace. It has the advantage of engaging staff, so it gives them a key role in the identification and development of positive change within the workplace. And this engagement also helps get their buy-in for any sort of later changes that need to be made. But just remember, it is a snapshot in time. So again, think about that theatre spotlight. It's like putting the light on and taking a photo of who's on stage at the time. So it may not be the whole picture. What it does allow you to do, though, is to show development and to measure areas that need improvement. And it can be repeated periodically, such as every 2 years. So it's a good indicator as to measure change and improvement. So I think it's worth saying, though, that changing culture is difficult. It can be quite challenging. It requires a lot of effort, and it does require to be driven from the top of the organisation down. it needs to happen bit by bit. So building the foundations, a bit like a strong, foundations for a house, and then from that develop a program of interventions. So they might include input and involvement and ownership by all staff in a full behavioural safety approach. It might involve risk awareness training, competency development, leadership workshops, and also making sure there's a clear defined approach to risk management. That'll all help drive a positive safety culture. And what's really key in that, I think, is the development of aims, objectives and appropriate key performance indicators. So I've used this phrase, it's been sort of dotted around. What does that phrase indicate about the safety culture in an organisation? The we, it shows there's a collective group, a social or a group of norms and behaviours. Always, to me, that means that those norms and practices are quite established. That way, well, that to me suggests that the particular practice that you might be talking about, or the action, is being challenged, and they are quite resistant potentially to change. There might be some defensiveness and there might be peer pressure to conform. So whatever that is that we're referring to, that will be the way things are done around here. So from my experience, this is not particularly indicative, if you hear this said, of an organisation that has embraced continual improvement and learning lessons from experience. So finally, I think your key takeaway for today is that in order to change safety culture, it's necessary to first understand what the elements are that may have given rise to it, that have produced it. So safety culture, is the product of the values, the motivations, and the expectations which sit below the surface. So in your own organisation, how are things done? What are the potential weaknesses that might be highlighted? Would they be procedures? Are they being followed? Are they appropriate to the tasks? Do they need updating? Communication. Are people able to have open, honest, two-way dialogue? Are people aware of the risks? Or is their risk awareness slightly questionable? Are they actually really, have they bought into the control measures in a meaningful way? Are there rule violations occurring? And if so, what are the underlying motivations for those? And certainly very much worth looking at. So a key note is that rule violation from malice or recklessness, particularly in the workplace, is really rare. Most people, want to do their job well. They want to be productive and they want to go home safe at night or in the morning if they've worked night shift. So it's really important to understand the why behind near misses, human errors and non-compliance. Recommend the safety culture tools and questionnaires. They take that snapshot and they identify areas for improvement. That said, though, it isn't a quick win. It does need to be encompassed within a behavioural safety programme for sort of solid, to build those solid foundations to move up the maturity ladder. And again, understanding the motivations, and they might form the barriers and enablers to changing behaviour. But one size won't necessarily fit all. So I have mentioned that obviously every individual in the workplace will come to work with their own values as well as those that they form part of the group with. And I'd just like to throw in, try and avoid linear thinking when you're looking at safety culture. So remember, it's multifaceted. There's an interaction of factors. Don't think, for instance, that it'll be because of this. It might be because of this for one person, but actually those, if we go back to the earlier slide and look at that circular influences into the safety culture, whether that be supervision or procedures, the impact of each of those elements, those core elements, may be stronger for some individuals or for some parts of the workforce more than others. So it's not a case of A equals B in linear thinking. It might be a whole holistic mix that you've got to consider. And involve, if you want to continually improve your safety culture, you need to involve all levels of the workforce. I think, like most things in life, communication is absolutely key. So I'd like to now open it up to questions.
Okay, thank you, Liz. Yes, so if you do have any questions, please type them in using the instant messaging function. We've got 3 questions here at the moment, all good ones actually. So first one is from Alex. Have you found it harder to implement a safety cultural change in small businesses and businesses which are not classed as major hazardous facilities? If so, why do you think this is?
I think those sorts of changes very much depend on the business. So I can only really answer that from my experience outside of risk tech. So as an ex-regulator, it was far easier to use a sort of carrot approach than a sort of regulatory stick to convince people of why they should be putting in greater risk controls, for instance. And I think I go back to the most people want to do a good job, and I think you just need to understand that for most people is more than just being profitable. It is actually about having a good reputation in whatever industry you're in. So even if I was the lead inspector for waste industry, which obviously is very high hazard, but can be family-run small businesses with a lot of peripatetic workers going out, obviously with skip lorries and large vehicles. And I think for me it was understanding what their motivations were and communicating it in a way to get their buy-in. So I wouldn't say it's more difficult. I would say it's different.
Okay, thank you, Liz. A question from Anthony. Could you suggest some techniques and methods to influence managers who always look at past performance as an indicator of the future behaviour of staff? For example, Anthony often hears of the individual, oh, he's a bad apple, or he's got a bit of a history, and so
on. Okay, so I think there is some value in looking at the concept of just culture. So if you are constantly hearing that someone's a bad apple, or that suggests that the bad apple is still in the in the cart, if you like, so that people aren't being necessarily penalized for poor performance, or that the poor performance isn't really being understood. So again, that why question needs to be asked. In the context of looking always backwards, you're going to get stuck at the calculative point in the maturity model, because you're not really looking how something is evolving. Just because of how something has occurred isn't always a precursor for how it's going to occur next time. So I think for me, looking at barriers and safety culture in particular, I think you need to be sort of looking forwards and backwards, an eye to the future, learning from your past, if you like. I'm not sure if that totally answers the question. As I say, I did think actually about the bad apple analogy before I started today. And I think the just culture is useful because if people aren't seen to being able to have the open and honest communication as to say why something is going wrong, then they're going to lose faith in the safety management system. And trust is a very key element. But equally, I think we've moved a long way from the no blame culture, in the sense of people do need to see that people have to be held responsible for the consequence of their actions, not necessarily punished. I mean, they just have to be understood, and that includes the managers. They have to lead by example.
Okay, great. We've got a couple of questions we should be able to fit in. Question from Steve, really good one. What positive or negative changes have the last 9 months made to organisational or safety cultures, given the pandemic? And can the good ones be sustained and the bad ones recovered from easily?
Right, okay. So, but you might have to break that question down. Let me.
So I guess it basically is asking, we've had 9 months of COVID-19.
Hmm.
Everybody in the world knows about it, everybody in the workplace. So on the one hand, you think people would probably be more, this is my interpretation of the question, on the one hand you might think it would be more positively aware of safety culture and the need to protect oneself and others. On the other hand, maybe there are things like less supervision,
Yes.
fewer resources at work for getting hazardous work done. I don't know. Maybe the question's around that.
So I think there have been a lot of really positive changes, which are things like more efficient working. I think there's been a lot less unnecessary travel, which has allowed, on one hand, people to have a greater work-life balance, spend greater time at home, not sort of travelling away from their families. I think remote working and ability to be flexible has been great. I mean, if we're looking at dissemination of information, for instance, and the use of sort of remote webinars, etc., I didn't think we all thought we would be doing that. I think the negative changes and I think this is going to be something that's going to be worthy of many PhDs following COVID-19. I think have yet to unfold and really understand what they mean. What we have seen is what appear to be greater rule violations, particularly in the workplace. But I think it's very quick and easy to say, oh, someone made a mistake or they violated a procedure without understanding, how that's arisen. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done, looking at some of the sort of cultural shifts, for instance, presenteeism, whether or not people should come into work when they're unwell, whether or not people are now making mistakes because they are more fatigued, more anxious, etc. Whether whether the supervision is actually a factor in this. Do people behave better when they're being watched? That's debatable on the environment, actually. And the task that's being carried out. If we think back to sort of like your driving test, you drive better when someone's scrutinising you sat in the passenger seat, not necessarily. What I think will be interesting is whether or not things like the perhaps reduced frequency in competency management, in assessment, whether or not that will have an impact, whether or not people are getting the same level of training, and whether that's negatively impacting on how they apply safe systems of work. Teams are definitely smaller, so we've seen incidents in the workplace where perhaps work equipment has failed or been used inappropriately, and is that because someone had a memory lapse? Is it that they thought they'd done something but they were fatigued and they perhaps hadn't? I'll give you an example of working at height with the drill, and it should have been tethered to the platform with a lanyard, and it wasn't, and a near miss arose in a workplace. One of many sort of near misses and, if you like, smaller incidents that had the potential to have bigger consequences. Is that as a result of COVID-19 that people are now working under greater pressure because instead of being a team of two with two people carrying kit, maybe there's only one? So I think at the moment it's not clear what those changes are, but I think it's going to be really interesting to see how quickly people change or revert back to old practices, if at all.
Okay, thank you. We've got two final questions. Let's see if we can get through these in the next couple of minutes. So a question from Jacqueline. Is the risk assessment process and culture, is it perhaps too much oriented towards complying with the country's rules and regulations rather than the person's understanding and awareness? Put another way, I suspect this may be an organisation was strictly following all the rules and regulations required by government, but we might be underestimating the individual's ideas or understandings or awareness of the latest environment.
Is this general safety rules and regulations or specific to COVID?
I think we'll take this as a general
right,
question.
Okay. I mean, from an organisational point of view, so going back to organisational culture, the need to comply with regulatory requirements is a huge sort of pressure on them, a driver of organisational behaviour, if you like, and the success of how that works down through the organisation depends on how that's communicated. Most rules and regulations in the UK have guidance as to how they should be applied, which should, at least in theory, give the organisation some assistance in how you communicate the purpose behind them. And if you can communicate the purpose behind them, then there is hopefully, resulting in that, a greater understanding by the individual as to why they've got to follow the rule. So, for instance, if we look at hearing loss, why you need to wear hearing protection, you can explain to somebody that you are at this particular level in this particular zone in a workplace, you must wear hearing protection, because at a certain level it will be detrimental to you, and that is backed by science. So. I think in terms of people following rules, it's necessary to have their understanding, but I think from an organisational point of view, I suspect managers will just be, well, they are the rules, which isn't necessarily a very healthy way of moving up the maturity ladder, but would at least get you to, it depends what stage you're at, I think, as well, how much that would apply.
Okay, Liz, thank you. Let's take the final question then from Alex. Intervening on unsafe acts is an activity which I find seems to be one of the hardest things to implement in the workplace, especially where there is older experience that's been questioned. Management can initially do this with more confidence or assertiveness, but cold-faced individuals find it more difficult. I find it is a good marker for an evidenced safety culture if it's recorded and shared. Any thoughts on that?
I completely agree with Alex's opening statement. It is incredibly difficult. It causes quite a lot of stress amongst the workforce if they feel that it's been left to them to do. And because of that, that's why, and I haven't covered it today, as part of sort of safety culture tools, etc., another way of measuring your safety culture is to do like observations, walkarounds, and they're often done by someone who is potentially more neutral, i.e. the safety manager or the compliance manager or an auditor, because then they can do that in a more impartial way, which takes it away from, I think the word's been used, cold-faced individual. So but I think a really good example of that, coming back to the COVID-19 example, is the pressure, if someone isn't following social distancing and the sort of stress that that's causing in the workplace, if people feel that they're being put at risk, and it undermines. I mean, basically the consequence of that is it undermines your trust and your faith in the safety management system. So it really does need to be addressed, and it's often if you like, a sort of catalogue, a sort of toolkit of different approaches. So if you identified that was the problem, you would want a sort of multifaceted approach, but I would start with a safety tool.
Okay, thanks, Liz. I think we do need to wrap up now. We're just over sort of 48 minutes there. So what we will do is make a recording available to everybody. That'll probably be, I guess, the end of this week, early next week now. If you have any questions arising from what you've heard today, or you'd like any information on our services, then you can simply email us directly. Liz will just pop up some email addresses on the screen there. And feel free to visit our website as well, risktech.tv.com. There's a whole load of there's an inquiry form on virtually every page on the website. You can just pop in your question or inquiry and press it through, and we'll try and get back to you as soon as possible. So thank you, Liz, again. Thank you, everybody else, for attending. We really do appreciate you taking the time out of your day to listen in this penultimate webinar of the current program. The final one is on Thursday this week, same time, 3 o'clock UK, where we're going to be talking about the ALARP principle. Okay, so stay safe, stay secure, and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.